So my name's Kirsten Abernethy and I'm the Executive Officer of Women in Seafood Australasia, or WISA. And we've also got Heidi Mummy here, who is the President of WISA, and we've got some of the board members here. So thank you all for coming. On behalf of myself and WISA, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of these lands and waters, the Wadawurrung people. I acknowledge and respect their continuing connections to their lands and waters, their stories, traditions, and living cultures, and the contribution to the life and spirit of our community. I pay respect to the past, present, and future elders and extend this respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. So I'm very excited to welcome and introduce our guest speaker today, Alana Johnson. But just before I do, I just wanted to let you know about the other webinar series, the other webinars we've got coming up. They're on every Tuesday and Friday at 1 o'clock Eastern Standard Time for the month of March. So next week, we've got Kylie Dunstan and Sky Charry. So Kylie is from a multi-generational fishing family in Queensland and a leader in the industry who's made a real difference in Queensland to the fishing industry there. Sky, so I heard Sky Charry speak a few years ago at the Women in Agriculture conference, and her research on workplace sexual harassment of rural women completely blew me away. So there's a short film called Grace Under Fire that's good to watch before her webinar next Friday. Then the following week, we've got Heather Brayford and Joe Marshall. Heather's the Deputy Director General at DPIRD in WA, working across fisheries and ag. And she's going to be talking about her leadership journey in the industry in an extremely male world. Joe Marshall, if you don't know her, she's been spearheading the Stay Afloat program, which is improving mental health in the seafood industry from the grassroots up. This is a program of work that was brought to the industry attention through WISA, starting that conversation, getting the research done, and now the industry has this program to make real change. Then for our last webinar, we're really lucky to have Simone Heyman, a third-generation tuna farmer from Port Lincoln. Simone's story is excellent, and she's showing the industry what can be done when the new generation of women and men get together and collaborate and innovate with their new business, Kin Seafood. So on behalf of WISA, I'd like to thank all of the women for giving their time to be part of this series. And I really encourage you to get online at Eventbrite and book in for the next webinars. But we've got Alana Johnson, who's an absolute pioneer in women's leadership and gender equality, especially in the agriculture and rural space. I met Alana 5 years ago, and she's been a mentor to me and has completely inspired my journey in advocating for women in the seafood industry. Alana's going to be talking today around the theme for International Women's Day, Breaking the Bias, and what this means for rural and regional women in Australia. Alana's recognised for her work in gender equality, community activism, and rural leadership in Australia. In 2020, Alana was appointed a member of the Order of Australia for her services to women and was named in the inaugural 100 Women of Influence in Australia by the Australian Financial Review. Alana is also a fifth-generation farmer, breeding cattle and growing trees near Benalla in Victoria. So we're really lucky to have Alana speaking to us today. And so first up, she's going to be doing a bit of a talk, and then we're going to have a question and answer session. So welcome, Alana.
Thank you so much, Kirsten, and it's a delight to be here. And thank you for your acknowledgement of country. I'm normally sitting in my office on my farm at Benalla, which is on Tangerong country. And today I'm actually sitting in an apartment in Warrnambool. And it made me realise I actually didn't know and don't know the name of the country here. But the other thing that really struck me today, and I had never had any reason to think about it before, as I sit before all of you women the oceans and the sea are integral to your life, and I'd never really thought of acknowledging land and water. And I'll go away and actually think about that now and think about how important that is. I know that as women in agriculture, we acknowledge land because we do feel an incredible connection, and we feel it is a due respect to the First Nations people. And I'm sure all of you feel that same about the waters and the ocean. So thank you. You learn something new about everything you do. You learn something new. So thank you for that new learning for me. And I gather we've got women here from all over Australia and therefore all sorts of lands and waters. So it's wonderful to have this sort of gathering. In my short time with you today, I thought I would speak about two things. One is my story as a woman in agriculture and some of the background to why I'm saying some of the things that I'm saying today. And then I will talk about the International Women's Day theme, Break the Bias, and we'll round up with some lessons learnt from the history of women in agriculture and what might be useful to take us forward. So I'm looking at my watch, and Kirsten will give me a hoy when I need to stop. I'm not ever short of a word, so I might just keep blabbering along. It's one of the things about Zoom, you can't get sort of a sense of your audience, so you don't know if they're bored or if they've walked away to have a cup of tea or what's going on. So it's a matter of faith, and I'll just go forth and go with it. So I'm a great believer that as women, it's really important for us to know about the women who've gone before us. You know, all those sayings that we've heard about, you know, we stand on the shoulders of the generations before us is really true. And I know in my life, it was a really important thing for me to understand the women who did all that early work at the turn of the 1900s, who were responsible for women even getting to vote in Australia. So the suffragette history was a really important thing for me to understand. And one of my really interesting revelations from my researching all of that was learning about the monster petition that was delivered to the Parliament of Victoria with the signatures of about a third of the Victorian population in the early 1900s. And on that monster petition was the name of one of my great aunties. And so when you find your own connection to these really pivotal things about women's history, it locks you in even more. So I've sort of made a commitment now, because there's, you know, new generations of women coming through, and it's really important that we share the story. I often say to people, isn't it interesting, even the word history, which starts with his, and history really is men's history. And it's up to all of us to actually make sure that her story becomes part of our national narrative. And it certainly isn't at the moment. Back in the 1970s, almost the last Australia Encyclopedia was published. And you know, everything's online these days. But anyway, the Australia Encyclopedia was published in the 1970s. And where did women appear in it? Well, they actually appeared between wool and wombats. And it was a sort of about half page. And I sat there looking at it thinking, like all these fabulous women who've created Australia to be what it is, right back to, you know, as I said, Vida Goldstein, the world famous suffragette who came from Portland and who was the first woman in Australia to stand for Parliament. No one ever knows her story. So we've got a long way to go as we place women and their stories at the centre of what we see as important in our nation. So I'm going to tell you a little potted history of my story, which gives you a little glimpse into the story of women in agriculture in Australia. I'm fifth generation farming family from near Hamilton in the Western District of Victoria, and fifth generation of invisible women, I say. My grandmother, who I knew when she was on the farm, and my mother, their lives were busy, they were productive. My grandmother, I'm sure, saved the bacon on the farm many times. She raised ducks, she made butter, she sold eggs, she did all sorts of things that actually brought income to the family. But she was totally invisible, and certainly no one would ever call her a farmer. And that was just the way things were. The only female farmers around were sort of the odd woman who was either a widow because her husband had died and she'd taken over the farm, or perhaps she was the only child of someone who had passed on, and she inherited the farm because there were no sons, and it was very normal for the sons to get the farm. So the notion of a woman farmer, even back in my childhood in the 1960s, was fairly rare. So one of the interesting things that happened in 1974 was the Labor government made university education free. And that was transformative of Australia. It certainly was transformative of rural Australia, because of what it meant was lots and lots of young women like myself, first generation in our family, went off to university. And we flooded the universities right in the middle of really the women's liberation movement. You know, Germaine Greer, the whole thing was a hotbed in the mid-70s. It was a really exciting time. Young women like me, and I had been to Melbourne once in my life before I went to university, like this, I couldn't believe this other world that existed. And so it was an interesting time also, because the young men, a lot of the young men didn't go to university. Their paths were already set. They were inheriting farms, they were doing apprenticeships, they were doing all sorts of things. They never actually were part of that huge influx into universities. So myself and heaps of other young rural women headed off to university, and most of us wanted to go back home to our rural and regional towns and areas. And we headed back, you know, in the late 70s and the early 80s, never to want to live the lives that our mothers and grandmothers had. Never to want to, we didn't ever want to be the farmer's wife. We never wanted to be invisible. We went back with a sense of we should be recognised for what we were going to do in terms of our work and our lives, and we wanted a different sort of partnership with the men. It was a bit of a shock to a lot of the young men back then, mind you, because yeah, they hadn't been part of the consciousness raising that we had. So it took us a bit of work, and there was a fair bit of pushback in some ways. But it was really interesting also because we had this influx of like incredibly well-educated young rural women coming back into the farming sector, more educated than their partners. And that had a huge impact on the sector forevermore. So to skip forward a little bit, it didn't take long for young women to find each other in the 1980s across rural Victoria and decide to form a rural women's network, knowing that if we were going to make any progress, we had to do it together. We had to support one another. And it was a really important part of creating what we now know and call the rural women's movement in Australia. And that finding, like you have done, the finding of other women and creating a network is the most powerful thing we can do. So the Rural Women's Network then sparked networks in other states, and each state had its own form. And by the early 1990s, there was a sense that not only did we want to network together, but we wanted more to happen. And that was the impetus for developing Australian Women in Agriculture as an organisation, and then for us being absolutely outrageous and bold enough to decide we would hold the first international conference for women in agriculture, which happened in Melbourne in 1994 at the University of Melbourne. Women from 80 countries came. We had over 800 women there. It's still the largest agricultural conference that's ever been held in Australia. The Governor-General ended up opening it. All of a sudden, talk about visibility, women in agriculture were on the world stage, the national stage. Things were really happening. So it was an incredible pivotal turning point for how people perceived women in agriculture. Just quickly, while I'm still talking about history, and this may well be relevant to women in the seafood industries, I now look back and see the journey of Australian women in agriculture in 4 parts, or 5 parts really. First was the part we didn't want anymore, the invisibility. I can remember one of the women who was somewhat older than me coming to Women on Farms gathering in the early or the mid-1980s, one of the first ones, and she had raised a family. She had, you know, teenage children. And I can remember her saying, I came to this Women on Farms gathering as a farmer's wife, and I'm walking away as a farmer. And so that mindset change was incredible. That sense that I'm not going to put up with being invisible anymore. I think that the first call we had through our Rural Women's Networking and Australian Women in Agriculture was actual recognition and acknowledgement of what we were worth even economically to agriculture in Australia. We did a whole lot of background work. We knew what women's labour equaled in terms of the input into our sector. We found out things like, and this is, you know, old school stuff, back in the 1980s, some research that said 80% of the cheques written on farms were written by women. So we actually had economic power. We were the decision makers. So there was a sense that women really wanted to be recognised for the contribution that they were making to the sector. And we really went very savvily around collecting that information and presenting it, like I know you have, because I've read the work that's been done already that's on your website. And that sort of recognition and acknowledgement of contribution is a really important starting point. I think the next thing that we did was then to demand a voice. We weren't going to be quiet anymore. And so doing things like Women on Farms gatherings gave women a sense of how to find their voice, how to have a voice, how to actually speak up, not to be silenced, not to feel that there wasn't a place for their voice in the culture of their, particularly, you know, the dairy industry was actually a lot better than the cattle industry where I belonged. You know, women just didn't speak up. You know, looked nice and went to the bull sales, and that was about it. So finding voice, I think, really was the really big focus of the second part of the Women in Agriculture movement. It was through finding voice that then I think women got really much more demanding and said, okay, we have a voice, but it's not around the decision-making tables. Where are the women on the boards? Where are the women around the business tables? We not only do we want a voice, but we want a seat. And so a lot of work was done. In fact, we can go back to find some really good work that was done by the federal government. There was a Senate inquiry into women's participation headed by Judith Troth, the Senator for Agriculture. And it was called Missed Opportunities, because I think there was a real recognition that the industry was actually missing out by not having women at those decision-making tables, that women had so much that needed to be there to drive the industry forward. So we slowly started to see more opportunity open up to women. The research and development corporations, and I know you have a fisheries one, God, it was slow. You know, one or two women sitting around those tables. I eventually, after applying 3 times and not even getting an interview the first 2 times, was appointed to the Rural Industries Research and Development Corporation. I still look at them now, and we're still not at, you know, 50% for any of them, I don't think. So we've really got a lot of work to do in claiming that space for women to have equal representation in our industries, and there's work there to be done. And so when we get to what we call equity, what does it look like? I mean, I think it really does look like that people look around the company table, the boardroom table, the government advisory body table, and what they see is men and women and people of all sorts of diversity, and it doesn't make a difference because they don't notice it. You know, like that it doesn't become the issue. And I think that that's one of the things that young women are getting to experience today in a lot of workplaces, that your gender isn't the issue anymore. And, you know, hopefully in our sectors, we will certainly get to that point. So that takes me on giving you a little bit of potted history about the journey of women in agriculture and what might be relevant to people and women in the seafood industry, to just take a few minutes to talk about the International Women's Day theme this year, Break the Bias, which is sort of clumsy language and a hard thing to understand. and not something you actually need to stop and think about and delve into. So we hear this sort of notion of unconscious bias thrown around, and what does it really mean? People just sort of assume that we understand, and really unconscious bias is actually about your brain. It's actually about how your brain categorises new information based on your previous experience and knowledge. So we have bias about everything, we have bias about how we drive the car. We've integrated skills and knowledge about driving that new information then is just reference to it. So in the agriculture sector, and probably in the seafood sector too, this notion of unconscious bias is buried deep in all of us. It's buried in places like when we might say, I'm going to ring the mechanic. Does everybody think about a man straight away? Probably. It wasn't that long ago in my early career when somebody was, at the bottom of a letter as Dr. So-and-so, that we assumed it was a man. It's really slow progress that we loosen our brains enough to actually include other people, particularly women, in some of those sort of taken for granted ways of thinking it. I had a friend who went to work on a kibbutz in Israel in the 1980s, and she came from Deniliquin. She was a big, strong, strapping farm woman who was nearly 6 foot tall, and she went to work on the kibbutz, and no woman was allowed to drive the tractor because they didn't have enough strength. And my big 6 foot friend was the first woman who was allowed to drive a tractor on the kibbutz. I mean, that is just unconscious bias, that notion, particularly around strength. It's been used in agriculture. It's probably used in the fishing industry too, as a way to exclude women. And most things today, as we know, actually don't take strength, they take brains. They take, being savvy enough to find out the most efficient ways to do things. So unconscious bias is about that stuff that happens internally in our brain where we've got these assumptions, these taken for granted assumptions that are just with us and they're part of society. So when International Women's Day talks about breaking the bias, they actually are calling on us to notice bias, to actually stop and think about it, to see the behaviours and the practices that are just taken for granted around us all the time, and to make an effort to really notice and call for it to be different, for it to include women, for it to include all sorts of people with disabilities, whatever. Bias is operating out there all the time. If we want to have our industries as, a place that we can all be proud of, that gives opportunity to everybody, then we all have to become aware of our biases, and gender biases is only one of them. So I think bias actually works at 2 levels, or perhaps even 3 levels. So as I said, there's this sort of bias about women and what they can and can't do. And I've mentioned that about the tractor. We thought women couldn't play football until not that many years ago, and now look at them. If we'd told a generation of men ago that women were going to be playing football with the same sort of skill that men did, they wouldn't believe it was possible. So that bias is just about what can women do. And I noticed that your research in your industry actually looks at the roles women play in the industry, and you can see the bias there. It's like in the water industry, all the engineers are men, and the women are doing the admin work, and they're doing the customer service work, and they're doing the organisational work. And within our industries, there's a bias as to what work is more likely to be done by men and women. And I'm sure there's a lot of you brave women out there who are actually working really hard to break that bias. But there's 2 other, I think, levels of bias that we need to be aware of and call out. And the first one is sort of making judgments without even knowing it about what women should be like. So we've seen a lot of this that we can be aware of. You know, women will get called bossy instead of being called a strong manager. You know, Julia Gillard was not warm and not like the sort of women that, you know, our mothers are. So she was told that she was wooden. You know, how many times did we hear that? Because she actually just didn't appear how people thought she should. She had an empty fruit bowl on her dining room table, for God's sake. She wasn't acting like women act. You know, you hear in organisations where a male leader might be talked about as having authority, and a woman will be talked about as being a bitch. You know, there is all of that is around us all the time as we have these notions about what we think women should behave like. And we will all carry those. We will carry those in us from the generations that have gone before us, and what we carry from what our families have told us and what society told us in our childhood. And so being in a workplace where you hear women referred to in disparaging ways or negative ways because they're acting perhaps like men might act, it's seen to be acceptable in men but not women. That's another form of bias that we really need to be aware of. I think the third level of bias that's operating out there is that people in the workplace particularly make assumptions about what goals and ambitions women have. And so they make biased assumptions about, oh, well, they're going to take time off to go and have children, or they'll never put their work ahead of their family, or, you know, if their husband moves jobs, we'll probably lose them. Or there's so many things out there that are operating as sort of unconscious biases about women's actual career ambition and goals and how they participate in their careers. We know from research that women are less likely to self-promote in the workplace, and it's one of the things that actually doesn't see them rise into higher positions in the workplace, because that's how women have been socialised. And so when women don't self-promote, no one knows what their goals and ambitions are. We're very poor at letting it be known. And one of the central things that I know now after years of being on different boards and being part of the Australian Institute of Company Directors is that men are really good at actually letting it be known that they'd be interested in a promotion or a position on a board, and they actually put it out there. And women sit back until a vacancy comes, and then they write an application and they just sit there with their fingers crossed that they might get selected. So underneath there's this operating, an assumption operating about how women will promote themselves. And there's still a bit of negativity about women who self-promote. Yeah, I think men are more, we accept it easier, men self-promoting than women self-promoting. But it's going to be up to all of us to actually, in a sort of like competent and respectful way, go about using our networks and letting people know what our goals and ambitions are for our careers and where we want to head. And not make assumptions that, oh, she's going to stop and have kids, or she won't come back, or all of the things that happen to women. So that's my three levels of bias that I think we all need to be aware of. So finally, I'm just going to say, so how do we break the bias? Well, the interesting point is, and it's a bit of a shock because as a woman who's been a feminist and been trying to create social change, most of my life is looking outwards at all the things that are wrong and all the things that need to change and doing something about them. You know, Australian Women in Ag go to Parliament House every year, and we can walk those corridors and knock on any door we want to. We've got ourselves in a position where people take notice of us. And so we've been very outward focused and very sort of social change focused. Breaking the bias actually asks something different of us. it actually asks of us to start with ourselves, to look in. Because if we're not aware of our own biases, then we're not going to actually be able to do much to create the cultural change where biases get broken. And so taking time and really being, I suppose, honest with yourself to say, did you make an assumption about that woman? Did you make a disparaging comment about that woman? Did you think that woman was sort of too pushy, or I didn't like her? Where are all those biases operating in your life? And pull yourself up about them. Because if we don't start with ourselves, how can we expect other people? Gandhi once said, be the change you want to see happen. That's the call for all of us in breaking the bias. We've got to be the change we want to see happen. And then in the workplace, I think when we see bias happening, when we see people acting in ways that are sexist about women, we've also got to have the courage to call it out. But perhaps we call it out not in a way that condemns someone, but we call it out in a way saying, do you realise that that's a bias, that's you're probably not even aware that you said that, and that's what it means. And all of us have our own biases, so we actually bring people's attention to the fact that bias is something we all carry, and they're not a bad person for having it. But if we want to see women be able to progress, then we also all need to become conscious of it and call ourselves out about it. And I think, so Break the Bias has a huge call on all of us to become exemplary, I suppose, in not allowing bias to cloud how we operate with other women or how we operate in our industry, and then some courage to actually say to other people, hey, do you think that is your bias? Are you aware of that? Bias holds us all back. And I'm not only talking about gender bias here, there's racial bias, there's age bias, there's all sorts of, that we can only improve society by calling attention to all of them. And finally, I think I want to say to you, in terms of women, particularly women in agriculture and the progress we've made over the last 30 years, I think the key thing that we've learned is that no one was ever going to change it for us. We were never going to be able to sit back and say, oh, there's so many unfair things about women in agriculture and they should be changed. Gosh, no one was going to do it for us. And people don't just make huge social change like the women's movement happen without women driving it. And it's a bit like marriage equality. It would never have happened without all the people who are out there, being loud and proud about what they wanted. So don't ever expect that your industry is going to improve for women unless you be the ones that improve it. And so I suppose that's a call out to you to say the changes that need to happen in your industry are only going to happen because of you. Madeleine Albright, who was the Secretary of State in the United States, she has this famous quote, and I often use it. She said, there's a special place in hell for women who don't help other women. And to me, it's a pretty harsh statement, but there's a lot of truth in it, because it's only other women who are actually going to make things better for women. So that's probably enough talking, Kirsten.
Oh, Lana, that was so good. I think I speak on behalf of everybody here. Thank you so much. We'll take questions. If people want to raise their hands or otherwise they can put a question in the chat, just let me know. I can start. Oh, Heidi, go.
Oh, you can go first if you like.
No.
Mine's more of a comment probably, I think, Alana, than a question. But thank you very much for an awesome talk and insight into, the things you've been involved in through your career. What really resonated with me in what you were saying today is that, you know, women being invisible and that mindset change stuff right at the start of your talk. I know a lot of this, and it probably resonated with a lot of other people online as well, because I think it's quite evident too that a lot of women, and I know through the stuff that Kirsten's been doing, a lot of women in the seafood industry actually don't see themselves as working as such within industry, and they are quite often those, you know, the women who do the books in the background or whatever it may be, and they don't actually, you know, recognise formally themselves as being part of, you know, the industry as such. So I think it is really important, and I know that's something that we at WISA are quite, you know, keen on trying to change that mindset and getting them to recognise that their contribution is so valuable and that they actually are really a huge part of the industry. So it was really more of a comment rather than a question as such.
Yeah, and thanks, Heidi. And I think one of the things that we can take with us, and this was a young woman friend that Kirsten probably knows too, from near Horsham, who they're lentil farmers. And she was saying to me that her husband's out on the tractor and he does the planting and the stripping and, you know, all of that sort of stuff. She does the marketing. How do they make their money in their business? From the marketing. Without the marketing, their business wouldn't be a success. And so we've got to start thinking about business in a different way than just producing it. So it's not just catching the fish and bringing them onto the boat and onto the shore, or growing the crop, or milking the cows. It's actually all of those other things that actually create the business. And so when we start to think about the business, then we actually create a lot of open space for recognising women.
Claire's one of our WISA board members.
Hi there. I just had a question about speaking up and that you have to be fearless and speak up in defence of women or calling it out. I was in a situation earlier this week where I did that, and it made the entire meeting incredibly awkward. And, you know, you had men whispering to other men, just shut up, or, you know, women secretly high-fiving me under the table, but not, and I knew that I had that family around me that was supporting in me calling out possibly some gender pay gap issues. But it was really awkward. And I mean, I would do it again, but I can see why some people shy away from it. And do you have any advice on how to deal with the awkwardness that often comes with speaking up?
Yep. So two things, Claire. I totally identify with you, and I've been doing that calling out for so long now. So I make a pre-statement before I do my calling out these days. I'm thinking about I'm on the Golden Murray Water Board, and I often say, I know I sound like a crack record. I know you've heard me say this many times before, but and so they just sort of know, oh, here she goes. Alana's got like her feminist lens on. So it's sort of like they just expect it of me now. And so the more you do it, the more you actually just get used to it, and people just sort of like, here she goes. but it's so important to give voice to it, because if you don't give voice to it and do it that way, then it just becomes, well, yeah, nothing changes. So finding a way to do it, even if it's done with a bit of humour or whatever, you know, I think we just got to take heart from looking at Grace Tame and, you know, the other young women who are out there ferociously calling things out at the moment. I mean, in some ways, in a louder way than has ever happened in generations before us. And it does take courage. And the one thing, I'm not sure how many of you saw that ABC program last year that Annabelle Crabtree called Misrepresented, about female politicians. But I can remember Julie Bishop pointing to this, and so many of the women who were interviewed did, and that was that if they're left as the lone voice around the table, then how really hard it is. And so what you need to do is to actually, when women do point something out or speak up, or if they're put down, that you speak up on their behalf. So you don't let a woman be a lone voice. And then if you can, Claire, and I don't know what the other women are like that you might have had in that room and around that table, but you sort of have that discussion with them outside the space and say to them, you know, if we're going to make some changes here and make being heard around this board table easier for all women, then if I do raise something, can you back me up? And you call, because without that sense of solidarity and strength, you'll just be dismissed. You'll be put down. You know, just remember those statements that were made about Julia Gillard, our first female Prime Minister. You know, she was personally condemned all the time. Julia, Julie liar. So the pushback can be hard, but we've got to do it, and we've got to be courageous enough and bring as many women on board to actually speak up and follow after you as you can.
That was a great question and a great response. Craig?
Can you hear me?
G'day, Craig.
Firstly, thank you, Alana, for your talk. And I've had the pleasure of meeting you, but I just, probably not so much a question, but a few comments. And I'd just like to say, you know, as a father of young girls that will probably come into the fishing industry or into the ag industry, it's, I, you know, just thank you for all your efforts and people like you and the wiser board that have, you know, highlight all these problems that there is. I sit on a lot of boards that are male dominated, and I always find, what I find is, and I don't know, and you may be able to give me some thought on this, is that men, I think, find when a smart woman comes in or has a really good idea or opinion, they feel threatened by that, and that doesn't allow that, you know, things to move forward. And also, like, how we can make other, you know, male-dominated industries understand that. As a kid, I remember my mum working hard alongside my dad, like, and she really did she did 95% of the work when it come down to it, but it was never acknowledged or seen that way. And I see that in the fishing industry a lot. It's just very under acknowledged. So I don't know how we can change that, but be interested on your take on that. But I like your breaking the bias part, and it really resonates. And yeah, I just like to get your thoughts how we put that out more so more men understand it and see it that way, I guess.
Yep. So thanks, Craig. I think you've hit on a couple of things. One, actually, Heidi alluded to in the chat just before. So breaking the bias is up to all of us. And so when there's good men out there who are prepared to also point it out in the public space, that is just worth so much. Because otherwise it's always women harping on, here they go again. So to have good men be able to say, hey, hang on, you know, I know that used to be the way people thought, but you know, things have changed, mate. We don't think like that anymore, or whatever it might be. I think to have men do that is just so meaningful, and we need to see that more. And it's really interesting, Craig. I've got two sons, young adult sons, and they do it all the time. It's like second nature to them now. Like when they're at the pub or some social thing, if a bloke behaves badly, they call it out.
Yeah.
And it's like an expectation of young people now. They actually just don't watch in silence. So we've made incredible progress with the next generation, I'm sure.
Yeah, there's definitely a change in the generation now. I noticed that with my daughters too. Their confidence more so than what I can remember when I was their age. So yeah.
And the other thing is, and I think this is, you know, good on you, Craig, for pointing this out, because, and I think so many good men know this, it is really hard to sort of feel like the pressure's on you to change the way that you have been and your industry's been all this time, you know, to be, you know, for farmers to be told that, you know, move over, recognise the women too, make space for them. Like, I mean, it can feel like some of your identity, some of the control you have over your own life actually is being taken from you. And you know, particularly for farmers and probably people in the seafood, men in the fishing industry, it is their identity. You know, they're known as a fisherman or a farmer. It is who they are. And when somebody comes along and actually says, we want to alter what this actually means, that's a pretty big threat. So I think all we can do is and I think one of the clever things Women in Ag have done is reassured people that, you know, your farmers are fantastic, fishermen are fantastic, but we now live in a different world where business savvy is just as important as being able to catch the fish or grow the crop. And so it needs all of us now, because the world's demanding a whole different way of us operating. And you know, women are bringing forward such important skills because we want to have successful businesses. So if you actually treat it from a business point of view rather than do the right thing, the moral do the right thing is probably not going to cut it. But the business focus, I think, in the end does cut it, because a lot of, well, male farmers know that the world has changed on them. And if they don't actually know how to deal with the milk company or, you know, sell their stock online or whatever it might be, and the stuff that their wives are so good at it, that their business would be a failure. So I think that economic approach, the business approach, is one way that men can go about helping other men see that they need to change.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because I definitely feel that way. Like in my fishing business, probably the good bit, I can do 10% of it really well when you look at the scheme of it, but it's all that other input. Like you're saying, the world's changed so much, you need that. And if you don't have that, women are more educated, like from my era anyway, than me. I left school very young to go fishing, so you don't move forward if you haven't got that expertise. So we just got to, try and banter that through to everyone. But thank you, Alana. Yeah.
Thanks, Brad.
Is there any other questions before I jump in? I think the conversation has been really interesting so far, and especially like now talking about not only, you know, what are the things that women can do to change and how we can organise and sort of start to try to break our own biases and support each other, but, you know, and then also like call out by like getting men as well to start calling out bias, because we had this interesting conversation on Tuesday when I presented the results of the project, which talked about, you know, that one of the real issues is is cultural and systemic problems, you know, not being valued, not being listened to, there being a boys' club and those sorts of things. And so, and how this is not just a women's issue, it's an industry issue. And I'm just wondering, from your experience in ag, kind of how, do you have any kind of examples or reflections on how you've been able to shift that dial at all, and what has made a difference or has there been any cultural changes? And if so, how was that sort of brought about?
Yeah, I think there has been significant cultural change, Kirsten, and I think there's a couple of reasons for it. Firstly, and this has been happening for a number of years now, probably half a dozen years, across Victoria at least, there's more women doing agricultural science and you know, farm management type courses than there are men. So the industry is attracting huge numbers of women. And I think people think of the farming industry in a broader context these days. Because the business has changed, we think about the agronomists, we think about the nutrition advisors, we think about the people who are doing the web-based work to sell your seed stock. You know, like everybody thinks about the business in a much broader way than milking cows or planting a crop or raising beef cattle. So I think when you actually get people to see your business in a broader context, rather than, so we've gone from thinking about farming, you know, on the farm, to the agriculture sector and agricultural business. So I think that transition needs to take place. So people are actually talking about a broader context, and then they see all the roles that women can have in that. So I think that causes the cultural change. It's really hard, particularly for people who've spent their whole life catching fish or milking cows, to push themselves to see the future and beyond what they have spent their whole life doing. And we need to do it in a way that doesn't diminish what they've done with their lives, but sort of say to them, you know, the demands on the industry are changing, the world's changing, we all have to operate in different ways. And so it's it's really easy to feel like you've been left behind or diminished. And I think a lot of men, in the way they've farmed for their careers, that's really easy for them to feel. So it is, and I do think what I said before, that when you actually start to talk about the skills and capacities that are required to run a successful business, rather than talking about fishing or farming, then you actually start to change the conversation. You start to make room for women's skills. You start to have a common focus together, because you're all in this to have a successful seafood industry sector. But it's slow.
Yeah.
It's very slow.
Yeah. And it goes back to like what Heidi said, and what, you know, like just things that we've talked about. You know, sometimes women say to me, oh, WISE's not for me. And because they're not necessarily, maybe they're not in a fishing business, or they're not in an aquaculture business, but they're, you know, they do consulting, you know, into the industry, or they're doing science for the industry, and they don't feel like they're part of the industry or part of WISE. And I think that's something that we're you know, WISE has been trying to shift, and we need to see it in ourselves, and then be able to, like, you know, start it as a broader conversation, maybe. Yeah.
So women in agriculture, I think we're seeing more diversity. You know, we consider vets as part of women in agriculture. We consider agronomists or whoever. So we are including a lot more women who are part of the industry in a bigger way. And I think that can only help us all. And what else I was going to say to you? Oh, it's gone now.
Okay, well, I think we're just about out of time. Does anybody have any final comments or questions that they would like to ask Alana? Okay, if not, we might wrap it up. But just before everyone goes, can I get everyone to turn their video on, and we'll do a screenshot of everybody so that we can promote the next webinars and, you know, and what we've been doing. So I'm going to try and do this. I'll just close this one.
While you're doing that, Kirsten, I just remembered the last thing I wanted to say.
Oh, good.
Right.
Yeah.
So this may well be very interesting to you. Some research was done about women in agriculture by Margaret Alston some years ago, and she was at Charles Sturt University at the time. And we were looking at why so many women in rural areas didn't want to call themselves feminists, didn't want to push the whole, you know, women's line. And she came up with this really interesting theory that applies to your industry as much as it does to agriculture. And that is, when your work is also your family, then it is really hard to take a stand, because you're taking a stand that can interfere in your marital relations. And so in your workplace, where you can go home from it and put it behind you, and you've just had, you know, a stand up with some man in the office, that is really different than actually having to stand up to the people in your family. So give yourselves a bit of slack, give yourselves a break. It's really hard. And so women will not be sort of hugely embraced, I'm going to be a feminist woman in the seafood sector, because the implications of it are really complex and broad reaching. So when your family and your business are tied together, it's a really big factor.
Yeah, and the word feminist kind of has like negative connotations for people as well. Okay, has everyone got their video on?
We've got a few that haven't yet.
Yes. Good on you, Claire. Okay, we're going to go with this. All right, everyone smile.
So you can see me, because I can't see me.
Oh, can't you?
I can't see anything.
Anyway.
I can see you. I could almost see Julie there for a second. All right. We ready? Okay, smile. It's probably extremely cheesy. All right. All right. Well, thanks, everybody. I hope that you enjoyed this webinar as much as I did. And I just want to say a massive thank you to Alana. Yeah, you're an inspiration, and we're going to be picking your brains, I think, a fair bit. Did you? Oh, Sally, would you like to say something?
No, she's
Okay, great. Well, thank you for